The ballroom glitters, a sea of wealth and whispers, but Samuel stands apart, a black man in a tailored tuxedo, his presence a challenge to the elite. He overhears a venomous sneer from a smug businessman, cloaked in charm. That filthy rat thinks he's king with his dirty money. A low-life Negro fool, nothing more. Samuel's eyes blaze, his fist clenching. He steps forward, voice a low thunder. Call me a fool again, and you'll choke on your lies. A dossier slams onto the table, proof of their scams. I'll bury you in court. The room freezes, the man's face ashen as Samuel walks away, a storm unleashed. How did he get here? What drove him to this moment? Stick with us to unravel Samuel's electrifying journey. Subscribe to catch our latest stories and share where you're tuning in from. Let's connect. Will justice prevail? You'll want to find out. The city's pulse throbbed through the cracked asphalt of the slum, a cacophony of car horns, shouting vendors, and the distant wail of sirens. Samuel trudged along the littered sidewalk, his work boots heavy with the day's grime. At 40, he was a striking figure, tall, broad-shouldered, his dark skin glistening with sweat under the fading sun. But in this corner of the world, his strength meant little. To the people who passed him, he was just another black man, invisible or suspect, his existence reduced to a stereotype. He adjusted the strap of his worn backpack, ignoring the sting of a fresh bruise on his shoulder from hauling concrete blocks all day. The construction site was a battlefield, not of fists but of glances, cold, cutting looks from co-workers who kept their distance, as if poverty and melanin were contagious. Just hours ago, a man in a crisp suit had clutched his briefcase tighter as Samuel walked by, barking, "Watch your hands, don't even think about it." Samuel's fists had clenched, his jaw tightening, but he'd kept walking. Words he knew were a luxury he couldn't afford. One wrong move, one raised voice, and he'd be out of a job, or worse. The street buzzed with life, but it was a cruel kind. Children darted through alleys, their laughter sharp and fleeting, while old men sat on stoops, eyes glazed with resignation. Samuel's gaze lingered on a faded mural of a black family smiling under a bright sun, now peeling and defaced with graffiti. It mocked him, a reminder of what he'd lost. He turned away, his chest tight, and pushed toward the sagging tenement he called home. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of damp plaster and yesterday's dinner. His apartment was a single room, its walls stained and pockmarked, the only light a flickering bulb that buzzed like a trapped insect. Samuel dropped his backpack and sank into a rickety chair, the wood creaking under his weight. On the table, a chipped mug and a half-empty pack of cigarettes sat beside a photograph, the only thing in the room that mattered. He picked it up, his calloused fingers tracing the faces. His wife, Lena, her smile soft and warm, their daughter, Amara, barely 5, clutching a stuffed bear. The memory hit like a fist. Lena's tears, her voice breaking as she said, "We can't keep living like this, Sam. I can't let Amara grow up with nothing." He'd begged her to stay, promised he'd find a way, but promises didn't pay bills. They'd left 3 years ago, and the silence they left behind was louder than any argument. Samuel set the photo down, his throat burning. He was a failure, not just to them, but to himself. Every day he woke up hoping for a spark, a chance to be more than a laborer scraping by on pennies. But the world had other plans. It saw his skin first, his worth second, if it saw him at all. He leaned back, closing his eyes, and let the weight of it all press down. The hunger in his gut, the ache in his bones, the whispers of doubt that grew louder each night. Was this it? Was he destined to be nothing more than a shadow in a city that didn't care? The next morning, the construction site was no kinder. The sun blazed, turning the air into a furnace, and Samuel's muscles screamed as he hefted another load of bricks. His co-workers, mostly white, worked in clusters, their laughter and chatter a world apart from him. He caught snippets, talk of weekend plans, new cars, lives that felt like fiction. To them, he was the guy who lifted the heavy stuff, nothing more. The foreman, a wiry man with a permanent scowl, barked, "Move it, Samuel! We're not paying you to daydream." The words were sharper than they needed to be, laced with something uglier. Samuel bit back a retort, his hands tightening around the brick until his knuckles ached. As the day dragged on, a delivery truck rumbled in, and the driver, a burly man with a sneer, tossed a clipboard at Samuel. "Sign this, and don't take all day." Samuel's eyes met his, holding the gaze a second too long. The driver shifted, uneasy, then muttered something under his breath that sounded like a slur. Samuel signed the form, his signature sharp and deliberate, and handed it back without a word. Inside, though, he was boiling, not just at the driver, but at the endless parade of slights, the 1,000 tiny cuts that bled him dry. Quitting time came, and Samuel stood alone at the site's edge, the city skyline a glittering taunt in the distance. Skyscrapers loomed, their glass facades catching the last light, symbols of a world that didn't want him. He wiped sweat from his brow, his breath heavy. Somewhere deep down, a spark flickered, a stubborn, fragile hope that he could be more, that he could claw his way out of this life. But as he turned toward home, the weight of reality settled back in, heavy as the bricks he carried. For now he was just Samuel, a man fighting a battle he wasn't sure he could win. The evening sun bled orange across the horizon, casting long shadows that danced over the cracked pavement. Samuel trudged through the familiar clamor of the city, his work boots scuffing against the grit of the sidewalk. His shoulders ached from the day's labor, each step a reminder of the endless grind that defined his existence. Sweat clung to his skin, and his worn backpack hung heavy, its straps cutting into his frame. The air was thick with the scent of exhaust and street food, a chaotic pulse that matched the churn in his gut. Another day, another dollar, barely enough to keep the lights on. His mind was a storm of exhaustion and quiet rage, wrestling with the same question that haunted him nightly. Is this all I'll ever be? He rounded a corner, the noise of the street swelling, vendors hawking their wares, a radio blaring from an open window, kids shouting as they chased a deflated soccer ball. Amid the chaos, a small figure caught his eye. A boy, no older than 12, stood on the curb, his thin frame swallowed by a tattered jacket. His pale face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp under hollow eyes, and his blonde hair stuck out in clumps, matted with dirt. He clutched a stack of lottery tickets, his voice hoarse as he called out to passersby. "Last few tickets! Help me out, please!" Most ignored him, their gazes sliding past as if he were a ghost. Something in the boy's desperation pierced Samuel's haze, a mirror of his own unspoken plea. Samuel slowed, his hand dipping into his pocket. He had 3 crumpled dollar bills and a handful of coins, his budget for dinner and tomorrow's bus fare. The boy's eyes met his, wide and pleading, and for a moment, the world quieted. "Mister, please," the kid said, stepping closer. "My mom's sick. Hospital bills. I just need to sell these last 5. His voice cracked, raw with a fear Samuel recognized too well, the kind that came from watching someone you love slip away. Samuel's chest tightened. He knew hunger, knew the weight of scraping by, but this kid's burden seemed heavier than his own. Without a word, Samuel pulled out the bills and coins, counting them in his palm. It was all he had, but the boy's trembling hands and earnest gaze made the decision easy. "I'll take 'em," Samuel said, his voice low, rough from the day's dust. The boy's face lit up, a flicker of relief breaking through his exhaustion. He handed over 5 creased lottery tickets, their edges worn as if they'd been clutched too long. "Thank you, mister. You don't know what this means." Samuel nodded, tucking the tickets into his jacket. "Go home, kid. Get some rest." The boy hesitated, then darted off, his small figure swallowed by the crowd. Samuel stood there a moment, the weight of his choice settling in. His stomach growled, but a strange calm washed over him. For once, he'd done something that felt right, even if it cost him his last dime. He turned toward home, the city's din fading into a dull hum as he walked. The sky deepened to a bruised purple, streetlights buzzing to life, and the ache in his bones seemed lighter, if only for a moment. Back in his cramped apartment, the single bulb cast a sickly glow over the peeling walls. Samuel dropped his backpack and sank onto the bed, its springs groaning under his weight. The ticket sat in his pocket, forgotten until he reached for his keys. He pulled them out, their cheap ink smudged, and stared at them. Lottery tickets, fool's hope, he'd always thought. Yet the boy's face lingered in his mind, those desperate eyes that trusted him to make a difference. With a sigh, he grabbed a coin from the table, more out of habit than expectation, and scratched the first ticket. The numbers revealed themselves slowly, each scrape of the coin a quiet ritual. Samuel's breath caught, a match, then another. His heart thudded, loud in the silence of the room. He scratched faster, the coin trembling in his grip. The ticket was a winner, a big one. Disbelief rooted him to the spot. He grabbed the second ticket, then the third, his hands shaking now. One by one, they unveiled the impossible. Every single ticket was a jackpot winner. Millions. The kind of money that could rewrite a life. Samuel's pulse roared in his ears. He stood, pacing the tiny room, the tickets clutched like fragile glass. This couldn't be real. He checked them again, holding them to the light, searching for a trick, a mistake. But the numbers didn't lie. 5 tickets, 5 wins, each one a fortune. His legs buckled and he sank back onto the bed, the coin slipping from his fingers. Laughter bubbled up, raw and disbelieving, echoing off the walls. Then silence, heavy and surreal. The world had shifted in a single moment, and he was unmoored, caught between the man he'd been hours ago and the stranger he might become. He rose, crossing to the window, the ticket still in hand. Outside, the city glittered, its lights a distant promise. For the first time in years, Samuel felt something stir, a spark of possibility, fragile but fierce. He thought of the boy, his small act of kindness now a pivot point in a life that had known too little mercy. Was this fate, luck, or something bigger, something he couldn't yet name? He didn't know. But as he stood there, the weight of poverty lifting for the first time, Samuel made a silent vow. Whatever came next, he'd face it head on. The next morning, he walked into a bank, the tickets folded carefully in his pocket. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with skeptical eyes, raised an eyebrow as he explained. She checked the tickets, then checked them again, her expression shifting from doubt to shock. This is legitimate, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel stood taller, his heart pounding, but his face calm. As he left with confirmation of his fortune, the city seemed different, brighter, sharper, as if it had been waiting for him to claim it. For now the future was his to shape, a blank page after years of erasure. Samuel stood at the edge of a new world, his pockets heavy with a fortune that still felt like a dream. The weight of poverty had lifted, replaced by a restless energy that coursed through him like electricity. Money, he'd always believed, was just paper, a means to survive. But now, with millions at his fingertips, it was a key, a weapon, a voice that could demand the world listen. He was determined to wield it, to rewrite the story of a man who'd been dismissed, degraded, and defined by his skin. Yet beneath his resolve, a quiet unease stirred, a whisper he couldn't quite name. His first steps were tentative, almost reverent. He wandered into a bustling market, the air thick with the scent of grilled meat and overripe fruit. Vendors called out, their voices a rhythmic hum, but Samuel's focus was singular. He bought a steaming plate of ribs, the kind he'd only eyed from afar. The sauce rich and tangy, each bite a small rebellion against years of hunger. At a clothing store, he ran his fingers over silk shirts and tailored jackets, their price tags once a cruel taunt. "I'll take them," he said, voice steady, as the cashier's eyes widened. He left with bags of luxury, his reflection in the shop window a stranger in crisp linen and polished shoes. Generosity came next, a compulsion to share his windfall. He slipped cash into the hands of neighbors, widows, single mothers, men like him who toiled for scraps. Their gratitude was warm, their eyes bright with disbelief, and for a moment Samuel felt like a king, benevolent and untouchable. But the world's gaze didn't soften. At a high-end boutique, a clerk followed him closely, her smile tight, her question, "Can you afford this?" A blade wrapped in politeness. Samuel's jaw clenched, but he paid in full, the transaction a silent defiance. The clerk's expression didn't change, and as he walked away, the victory felt hollow. the sting of prejudice sharper than ever. Anger simmered, a slow burn that money couldn't douse. If the world didn't see him, he'd make it look. He stepped into a gleaming restaurant, its chandeliers casting a golden glow over linen tablecloths. The maitre d' hesitated, his eyes flicking over Samuel's skin before settling on his expensive suit. "Table for one," Samuel said, his tone daring contradiction. Seated, he ordered the priciest dishes: lobster, caviar, a bottle of wine with a name he couldn't pronounce. Whispers rippled through the room, diners glancing his way, their curiosity laced with judgment. He tipped extravagantly, the bills fanning out like a challenge. The staff scrambled, their deference bought but not earned, and Samuel's chest swelled with a fleeting triumph. That night he found himself at a gala, a glittering affair where the city's elite mingled under crystal lights. The invitation had come through a contact at the bank, a nod to his newfound wealth. Samuel entered, his tailored tuxedo a perfect fit, yet every step felt like an intrusion. Men in crisp suits and women in sequin gowns swirled around him, their laughter sharp, their eyes assessing. A businessman clapped his shoulder, offering a cigar and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're the lottery guy, right? Quite a story." Samuel nodded, but the man's tone, patronizing, amused, grated like sandpaper. He was a curiosity, not an equal. The night blurred into a cascade of excess. Samuel drank champagne that fizzed like starlight, danced with women who pressed close, their perfume dizzying. He tossed money at every whim: rare whiskeys, VIP booths, tips that left waiters stammering. The crowd parted for him, their flattery a chorus. "You're living the dream. A man like you, unstoppable." Their words were honey, sweet, and sticky, and Samuel drank them in. He bought rounds for strangers, rented limos for midnight joyrides, and laughed louder than he had in years. The city became his playground, each dollar a brick in a fortress against the past. He was no longer the laborer, the outcast. He was Samuel, the man who could buy respect, who could bend the world to his will. Days bled into weeks, each one more extravagant than the last. He dined at rooftop lounges, the skyline a glittering backdrop to plates of truffle-dusted steak. He threw parties in penthouses, the bass thumping as guests, strangers mostly, cheered his name. He bought a watch that gleamed like a small sun, a car that purred with power. Art he didn't understand but hung because it screamed wealth. The faces around him multiplied. Men who called him brother, women who whispered promises, all drawn to the glow of his fortune. Their adoration was intoxicating, a drug that dulled the ache of memory. Lena, Amara, the construction site, they faded, replaced by a version of Samuel who lived in the moment, who was larger than life. But the high couldn't last. One night, sprawled on a velvet couch in a club pulsing with neon, Samuel felt the first crack. The music was too loud, the laughter too shrill. A woman draped across his arm giggled, her hand on his wallet, her eyes calculating. The man beside him, a self-proclaimed investor, pitched a deal that sounded like a trap. Samuel's smile faltered. He looked around, at the faces that shone with greed, at the hands that reached for his glass, his cash, his attention. Who were these people? Did they know him, or just the weight of his bank account? He excused himself, stepping onto a balcony where the air was cool and sharp. The city stretched below, its lights a constellation of promises that now felt distant. His heart thudded, not with excitement but with a creeping void. He'd spent thousands, maybe millions, chasing something: respect, belonging, a self he could stand to face in the mirror. But the mirror was empty. The man who'd bought ribs to savor freedom, who'd given cash to ease others' pain, was slipping away. In his place was a caricature, a king of fools crowned by flattery and fleeting thrills. Samuel gripped the railing, his knuckles tight. The gala's laughter drifted out, a mocking echo. He'd wanted to be seen, to prove his worth, but all he'd done was lose himself. The people inside didn't care about his dreams, his pain, his fight. They saw a wallet, not a man, and he'd let them, trading his soul for their applause. The realization was a blade cutting through the haze. He was rich, yes, but he was also alone, adrift in a sea of his own making. As he stared into the night, the city's glow no longer beckoned. It taunted, a reminder that money could buy many things, but not the answer to who he was meant to be. The engine of Samuel's new car hummed, a sleek beast that glided through the evening with a confidence he still couldn't fully claim. The leather seats cradled him, the dashboard glowed with promise, but his hands gripped the wheel too tightly, as if anchoring himself against the whirlwind of his new life. Weeks of lavish spending, parties, fine clothes, the adoration of strangers had left him dizzy, a man untethered from the laborer he'd been. Yet the thrill was fading, replaced by a gnawing ache he couldn't name. The city's pulse thrummed around him, but he felt like a ghost, haunting his own existence. He slowed at a traffic light, the hum of the engine a quiet counterpoint to the chatter in his mind. His gaze drifted to the sidewalk where a woman stood, her silhouette striking a chord deep within him. She was tall, her dark skin catching the glow of a street lamp, her movements graceful as she adjusted a worn scarf. Something about her, the tilt of her head, the quiet strength in her posture, stirred a memory. Samuel's breath hitched. He knew her. Years ago, in a moment of rare surplus, he'd given her money to cover her mother's hospital bills, a small act that had meant more to him than to her. His heart thudded, urging him to act before the light changed. He pulled over, the car's purr softening to a murmur. "Excuse me," he called, stepping out, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. She turned, her eyes narrowing with caution, then softening with recognition. "Samuel?" Her voice was warm, like a melody from a forgotten song. Up close, she was as he remembered. Kind eyes, a face etched with resilience. Her presence grounding in a way the glittering crowds never were. "It's been a while," he said, a smile breaking through his unease. She nodded, her gaze taking in his car, his suit, the man he'd become. "Looks like you're doing all right," she said, not accusing, just observing. He offered her a ride, and after a moment's hesitation, she climbed in. The car felt smaller with her beside him, her quiet dignity filling the space. They drove in silence at first, the hum of the city a distant backdrop. Then she spoke, her words soft but deliberate. "I never forgot what you did for my mom. That money, it saved her, you know." Samuel's throat tightened. He'd almost forgotten that version of himself, the one who gave without expecting anything back. "Just did what I could," he mumbled, eyes fixed on the road. But her gratitude was a lifeline, pulling him back to a truth he'd buried under champagne and flattery. They stopped at a small diner, its neon sign buzzing faintly. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and fried onions, the booths worn but welcoming. They sat across from each other, the table a bridge between past and present. She sipped her tea, her fingers tracing the cup's rim, and asked about his life. Samuel hesitated, the weight of his wealth suddenly cumbersome. He spoke of the lottery, the money, the parties, but his words felt hollow, like a script he'd rehearsed too many times. She listened, her eyes never leaving his, seeing through the gloss to the man beneath. Then she leaned forward, her voice steady but piercing. "You've changed, Samuel. This life, all this money, what's it for? What was your dream back then?" The question landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading through him. His dream? He opened his mouth, but no answer came. The man who'd once dreamed of a family, a home, a life where he was more than his struggles. That man was a stranger now. The parties, the cars, the crowds, they drowned out his purpose, leaving only a shadow in their wake. He looked away, his fingers tightening around his coffee mug, the heat grounding him against the vertigo of her words. She didn't press, but her silence was a mirror, reflecting his disquiet. "I don't know anymore," he admitted finally, his voice raw, the confession a wound laid bare. She reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his. "Then find it," she said, her tone firm yet kind. "You're more than this, Samuel. You always were." Her words were a spark, igniting something he thought he'd lost. A hunger not for wealth, but for meaning. For the first time in weeks he felt seen, not as a wallet or a spectacle, but as a man with a soul worth saving. They parted soon after, her number scribbled on a napkin, a fragile thread to a past he longed to reclaim. Samuel drove home, the city's lights blurring into streaks of gold and shadow. Alone in his apartment, he sat on the edge of his bed, the napkin in one hand, the photograph of his lost family in the other. Her question echoed, relentless. What was your dream? He closed his eyes, the weight of his choices pressing down. The money had given him power, but it had also taken something vital, his sense of self. As the night deepened, Samuel made a quiet vow. He would find that dream again, no matter what it cost. Samuel's resolve flickered like a candle in a storm. The woman's words, her question about his dreams, had cracked the veneer of his new life, exposing the hollow core beneath the glitz. He'd vowed to find himself again, to claw back the man he'd been before money reshaped him. But the world he'd built was a siren's call, its pleasures too loud, too close to ignore. The city's pulse thrummed with temptation, and Samuel, still raw from his reckoning, was not yet strong enough to resist. It began at a nightclub, the kind where the air pulsed with bass and the lights painted everything in electric hues. Samuel entered, his tailored suit a second skin, his presence commanding attention. He'd meant to stay briefly, to clear his head, but the crowd enveloped him, their cheers a drug he hadn't quit. Then she appeared, a woman with eyes like midnight and a smile that promised secrets. Her name was a whisper lost in the music, her touch electric as she guided him to a velvet-lined booth. "You're the man of the hour," she purred, her voice honey over steel, and Samuel, craving connection, let himself believe her. She was a vision, sleek, confident, her laughter a melody that drowned out his doubts. She leaned close, her perfume dizzying, and spoke of dreams that mirrored his own. Freedom, power, a life unbound by judgment. "You're different," she said, her fingers grazing his hand. "A king in a world of pawns." The words were a balm to his wounded pride, a spark to the ember of his ego. He ordered champagne, the bottles arriving in a cascade of fizz and applause. The night blurred into a fever dream, dancing, toasting, her laughter weaving through the chaos like a thread he couldn't let go. Days became a whirlwind of her presence. She was everywhere, by his side at rooftop parties, her arm linked with his in exclusive lounges, her voice coaxing him deeper into the life he'd sworn to leave. She introduced him to her circle, a glittering pack of charmers who called him legend and boss. They were young, hungry, their eyes bright with ambition, and they worshipped at the altar of his wealth. Samuel, intoxicated by their adoration, opened his wallet wider. He rented yachts for midnight cruises, the sea a mirror for their revelry. He bought her jewelry that sparkled like stars, dresses that clung like a second skin. Each gift was a tether, binding him to her, to them, to the man he was becoming again. Her suggestions were subtle at first, a new club to try, a business deal to consider. "You're too big for small moves," she'd say, her smile disarming. "Let's make waves." Samuel nodded, signing checks for ventures he barely understood, his trust in her a fragile bridge over his growing unease. The group's ideas were grand: real estate, tech startups, exclusive events, each pitched with fervor, each requiring his money to spark. He funded them, their gratitude a chorus that drowned out the warning in his gut. They toasted his vision, but their eyes lingered on his credit cards, their laughter a shade too sharp. Nights bled into mornings, the haze of excess clouding his clarity. At a lavish dinner, the table groaning with delicacies, Samuel caught her exchanging a glance with a man in the group. A quick, knowing look that vanished when she saw him watching. His stomach twisted, but her hand found his, her smile erasing the moment. "You're my rock," she whispered, and he wanted to believe her, needed to. He ordered more wine, the clink of glasses a distraction from the doubt creeping in like a thief. The tipping point came in a hotel suite, the aftermath of another endless party. Samuel woke to sunlight slicing through velvet curtains, his head pounding, his mouth dry. The room was a wreck. Empty bottles, scattered clothes, the air heavy with stale smoke. She was gone, but her perfume lingered. a ghost of her presence. On the table, a note in her looping script. Had to run, see you tonight. Beside it, a receipt for a nightclub tab, thousands of dollars charged to his card. He stared at it, the numbers blurring as reality sharpened. The gifts, the deals, the nights that bled his fortune, they weren't for him. They were for her, for them, a carefully spun web he'd walked into blind. Samuel sank onto the bed, the weight of his choices crushing. He'd let her in, let them all in, chasing a love that was just another transaction. The woman's face, her smile, her promises, flashed in his mind, each memory now tainted by suspicion. He'd been a mark, his wealth a magnet for their greed, his loneliness their leverage. The man who'd dreamed of meaning, who'd sat across from a woman who saw his soul, was buried again, lost in a maze of his own making. As he stared at the ceiling, the emptiness was a physical ache, a void no amount of money could fill. Samuel's world had become a gilded cage, its bars forged from flattery and excess. The woman's honeyed words, the sycophant's cheers, the endless nights of revelry, they had lured him back into a life he'd sworn to escape. Her promises of love, their pitches for ventures, had clouded his judgment, but cracks were forming. Doubts gnawed at him, her fleeting glances and their too perfect smiles now glaring warnings he could no longer ignore. He was a man teetering on the edge, caught between the man he wanted to be and the fool he'd let himself become. Tonight, at another opulent gala, the truth would shatter his illusions with a force that would either break him or set him free. The ballroom was a spectacle of decadence, chandeliers dripping light like liquid gold, the air thick with perfume and ambition. Samuel moved through the crowd, his tailored tuxedo a mask of confidence, but his eyes were sharp, scanning for her, the woman who'd spun his heart into knots. She was there, radiant in a dress that caught every eye, her laughter a siren's call as she leaned into a man from her circle, their heads bent in conspiracy. Samuel's chest tightened, but he forced a smile, joining them with a glass of champagne he barely sipped. Her touch on his arm was practiced, her voice a velvet lure. "You're the star tonight," she cooed, but her eyes darted to the man beside her, a silent signal Samuel now recognized. He played along, nodding at their banter, but his mind was a storm. The past weeks, her gifts, their deals, the way they drained his accounts, flashed like warning signs. He'd hired a private investigator days ago, a quiet move born of suspicion, and the preliminary report burned in his pocket. Shell companies, fake invoices, a trail of deceit leading to her and her crew. A lawyer, sharp and discreet, had already begun building a case. Samuel was no longer the naive mark they'd played. He was a man armed with truth, waiting for the moment to strike. The moment came in a quieter corner of the gala, where the music softened and the crowd thinned. Samuel lingered near a marble pillar, pretending to check his phone, when their voices reached him, her, the man, and two others from their clique, clustered behind a velvet curtain. Their words were a blade, each one cutting deeper than the last. "He's such a fool," the man sneered, his voice dripping venom. "A poor, filthy rat from the gutter, thinking he's one of us because he's got cash." Her laugh was sharp, cruel. "A dumb Negro with a bank account. Pathetic. He'll keep paying until he's dry, and we'll be long gone." Another chimed in. "That lowlife idiot doesn't belong here. He's nothing but a broke thug playing dress up." Samuel's blood roared, a tidal wave of rage and betrayal. His fists clenched, knuckles whitening, as their words, fool, rat, Negro, lowlife, echoed the world's old cruelties, the ones he'd fought his whole life. But this time, they'd miscalculated. He wasn't the broken man they mocked. He stepped from the shadows, his presence a thunderclap that silenced their laughter. Their faces froze, her eyes widening in panic, the man's smirk faltering. "Keep talking," Samuel said, his voice low, a growl that vibrated with fury. "Tell me more about the dumb Negro you've been fleecing." The man recovered first, puffing his chest. "What's your problem, huh?" "You heard wrong." Samuel's laugh was cold, a blade of its own. He took a step closer, towering over them. "Wrong? I heard every word, you snake." Before the man could retort, Samuel's fist connected with his jaw, a swift, precise blow that sent him staggering. The others gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but Samuel wasn't done. He grabbed the second man by the collar, slamming him against the wall. "Call me a rat again," he snarled, "and you'll need more than your lies to save you." The crowd nearby stirred, murmurs rippling, but Samuel didn't care. He released the man, who crumpled and turned to her. Her face was a mask of feigned innocence, but her trembling hands betrayed her. "Samuel, please, you're misunderstanding," she stammered. But he cut her off, pulling the investigator's report from his pocket and tossing it at her feet. "Misunderstanding? I've got bank records, emails, your fake companies. You thought you could bleed me dry and walk away?" He stepped closer, his voice a controlled inferno. "I trusted you. I thought you saw me. But you're just vultures picking at what's left of a man's hope." Her mask cracked, tears welling, but Samuel saw them for what they were. Crocodile tears, another performance. The man clutching his jaw spat, "You'll regret this, you nobody." Samuel's smile was ice. "Regret? No. You'll see me in court. My lawyer's got everything. Your scams, your victims, your lies. You're finished." He turned to the gathering onlookers, their faces a mix of shock and fascination. "These people," he said, voice ringing clear, "preyed on me, on others, thinking money makes you blind. But I see now. I see them." He shoved past the group, their protests drowned by the blood pounding in his ears. Security approached, but Samuel raised a hand, his authority undeniable. "I'm done here," he said, and they let him pass. He strode through the ballroom, the weight of their betrayal a fire in his chest, but also a clarity he hadn't felt in months. The money hadn't changed the world's view of him, fool, rat, lowlife, but it had given him power, and he'd used it to uncover their deceit. The investigator's work, the lawyer's strategy, had been his silent rebellion, a plan forged in the quiet moments when doubt became certainty. As he reached the exit, her voice called after him, desperate now. "Samuel, wait. We can fix this." He paused, not turning, her plea a fading echo of the lies that had ensnared him. "Fix yourself," he said, the words final, and stepped into the night. The air was sharp, cleansing, stripping away the haze of her perfume and their flattery. His rage still burned, but it was tempered by purpose. He'd been a mark, yes, but he'd also been a man who'd survived worse than their scams. Poverty, prejudice, loss. They'd underestimated him, and that was their fatal mistake. In his car, Samuel sat for a moment, the engine idling, his hands steady on the wheel. The report, now creased, lay on the passenger seat, a testament to his awakening. He thought of the woman from his past, her question about his dreams, and realized this was the first step toward answering it. He wasn't free yet, not from the pain, not from the world's judgments, but he was no longer their puppet. The lawsuit would come, the truth would unravel them, and Samuel would stand tall, not for his money, but for the man he was fighting to become. As he drove into the darkness, a single thought anchored him. He was awake now, and he would not sleep again. Samuel's heart thundered, a war drum in his chest, as he tore through the night, the car's engine roaring with his urgency. The gala's venomous words, fool, rat, lowlife, still burned, but his confrontation had ignited a fire of clarity. He'd unmasked the vultures, their lies exposed by the investigator's evidence, his lawyer's case ironclad, the woman's false tears, the man's swollen jaw, the crowd's stunned silence. They were behind him now, fading like a bad dream. He needed to find her, the woman from his past, the one whose question about his dreams had cracked his gilded cage. She was his anchor, his truth, and he had to tell her he was finally waking up. The courtroom loomed in his mind, a battleground where justice would be his weapon. Days after the gala, Samuel sat in the plaintiff's chair, his suit crisp, his gaze steady. The defendants, her, the man, their scheming clique, sat across the room, their bravado crumbling under the weight of evidence. Bank records, forged contracts, testimonies from other victims painted a damning picture. Samuel's lawyer, a hawk-eyed woman with a voice like steel, dismantled their defenses. "These individuals preyed on my client's trust," she declared, exploiting his wealth for their gain. The woman's eyes darted, her charm useless now. The man's sneer was gone, replaced by a nervous tick. The judge's gavel fell like a thunderclap. Guilty on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. Prison sentences were handed down. Years for her, longer for the man, the others scattered to cells where their lies couldn't follow. Samuel stood outside the courthouse, the air sharp with the promise of closure. Reporters swarmed, their questions a buzz he ignored. He'd won, not just for himself, but for every mark they'd bled dry. His fortune, though dented, was secure, and he'd funneled funds to help their other victims. Small acts that felt more like him than any penthouse party. Yet victory was bittersweet. The world's prejudices hadn't vanished with the verdict. They lingered in the reporters' skeptical glances, in the whispers that trailed him. Money had given him power, but it hadn't erased the scars of being seen as less. He slid into his car, the leather cool against his back, and let the engine idle. The dashboard's soft glow cast shadows across his face, mirroring the tumult within. He leaned back, closing his eyes, and let the past months unspool like a fevered reel. The lottery tickets, scratched in a moment of whimsy, had been a spark that set his life ablaze. He'd soared, savory meals, tailored suits, the heady rush of being wanted. He'd given generously, hoping to share his light, but the world's cold eyes had dimmed it. The gala crowds, the woman's flattery, the sycophant's schemes. They'd pulled him into a vortex of excess, each dollar spent a step away from himself. He'd gained wealth beyond imagining, but lost his compass, his dreams buried under champagne and lies. Her face surfaced in his mind, the woman from his past, her kind eyes and piercing question. What was your dream? She'd seen him, not his bank account, and her words had been a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge. The courtroom triumph, the unmasking of his betrayers, owed as much to her as to his lawyer. She'd reminded him of the man who'd given his last dollars to a desperate boy, who'd loved a family he couldn't keep. That man was still in him, battered but alive, and Samuel needed her to know. He needed to tell her he was trying, that her faith in him wasn't wasted. His hands tightened on the wheel, a sudden urgency seizing him. He had to find her, to speak the truth he'd only begun to grasp. The car's clock blinked, the hour late, but his resolve was iron. He shifted into gear, the engine's purr a call to action, and pulled onto the road. The city's lights streaked past, a blur of possibility and peril. He imagined her in her quiet apartment, perhaps sipping tea, her presence a calm he craved. What would he say? That she'd saved him? That her question had been the mirror he needed? The words churned, unformed but urgent, as he navigated the familiar streets. His foot pressed the accelerator, the car surging forward, his heart racing with purpose. He was close now, her address a memory he'd held like a talisman. The road curved, the world narrowing to this moment, this need to connect. Then a flash, headlights blinding, a truck barreling from the side. Samuel swerved, tires screeching, but the impact was a sledgehammer, metal crumpling, glass shattering. Pain exploded, then darkness, swallowing him whole. He jolted awake, gasping, his body slick with sweat. The world was wrong, gritty, hot, the air thick with dust. He was sprawled on a pile of sacks at the construction site, the sun blazing overhead. His co-workers' distant shouts a jarring return to reality. His hands fumbled, searching for the car, the tickets, the courtroom papers, but found only his worn jacket, his empty pockets. A dream. It had all been a dream. The lottery, the wealth, the betrayal, the victory, her. His chest heaved, disbelief warring with a strange relief. He wasn't a millionaire, wasn't a mark, wasn't a hero. He was just Samuel, the laborer, the man who'd fallen asleep on his break. He staggered to his feet, the dream's weight lingering like a bruise. The gala's insults, the woman's question, the courtroom's justice, they weren't real, but their truth was. He'd seen himself clearly, his flaws and his strength, in a way the waking world rarely allowed. The boy's face flashed in his mind, the one who'd sold him the tickets, and Samuel's resolve hardened. He grabbed his backpack, the workday done, and headed for the street where he'd met the kid. There he was, small and weary, clutching his stack of tickets. "Mr. Last Five," the boy called, his voice a haunting echo. Samuel stopped, his breath catching. The dream had been a mirror, but this was real. He dug into his pocket, finding a few crumpled bills, his last as always. "I'll take 'em," he said, handing over the money. The boy's eyes lit up, a flicker of hope that mirrored Samuel's own. "Thanks, mister," the kid said, scampering off. Samuel held the tickets, their edges rough, but didn't scratch them. Instead, he tucked them away, a talisman of a lesson hard won. "Kid," he called after him, "you reminded me what matters." The boy didn't hear, already lost in the crowd. But Samuel's words were for himself. The dream had shown him his heart, generous, flawed, resilient, and he wouldn't forget. As he walked home, the city's weight felt lighter, his steps surer. He wasn't rich, wasn't free of prejudice, but he was awake, ready to fight for the man he could still become. Samuel's steps echoed with a quiet purpose as he left the boy with the lottery tickets behind, the weight of the dream still pulsing in his veins. The vision, riches, betrayal, courtroom triumphs, and the woman who'd stirred his soul had been a crucible, burning away the fog of his despair. It wasn't real, but its lessons were, etched into him like scars that strengthened rather than weakened. He'd seen himself clearly, a man capable of generosity, vulnerable to temptation, but resilient enough to rise. The tickets in his pocket, unscrambled, were a reminder, not of wealth but of the choice to be more than his circumstances. As he walked, the city's hum felt less like a taunt and more like a challenge he was ready to meet. Years passed, not in a blur but in deliberate, hard-won strides. Samuel had returned to the construction site the next day, his back still aching, his hands still calloused, but his heart alight with a fire the dream had kindled. He worked with a new focus, saving every spare dollar, studying at night by the flicker of his apartment's lone bulb. He learned the craft of baking, drawn to its quiet alchemy, flour and water transformed into sustenance, a metaphor for the life he was rebuilding. With his savings, he opened a small bakery, its counter modest but his pride immense. Each loaf he shaped was a defiance of the world's low expectations, a testament to the man he'd chosen to become. Now, on a crisp morning, Samuel stood behind that counter, the air rich with the scent of fresh bread. His apron was dusted with flour, his smile warm as he handed a warm roll to a regular, a kid who reminded him of the lottery boy. The bakery was small, its walls plain, but it was his, a sanctuary built from sweat and stubborn hope. Customers came and went, their chatter a soft rhythm, their coins a steady pulse that kept the lights on. Samuel moved with ease, kneading dough, sliding trays into the oven, his hands sure in a way they'd never been with a trowel. This was his dream, not the gilded fantasy of the lottery, but something tangible, rooted in the act of giving. He changed in other ways too. The dream had taught him to see people clearly, not just their smiles but their intentions. He helped where he could, free bread for the hungry, a kind word for the weary, but he guarded his heart, no longer swayed by flattery or false promises. His life was simple, his apartment still sparse, but the photograph of his lost family now sat beside a small vase of flowers, a nod to healing. The pain of their absence lingered, but it no longer defined him. He was Samuel, the baker, the man who'd found worth in his own hands. Midday brought a lull, the counter empty save for a few crumbs. Samuel wiped it down, his thoughts drifting to the dream's vivid echoes. The woman's face, her kind eyes, her question about his dreams, haunted him still. She'd been a figment, yet her presence felt like a promise, a spark he carried into this new life. As he straightened, the bell above the door chimed and a woman stepped in. She was tall, her dark skin glowing under the soft light, her scarf slipping as she glanced at the display. Samuel froze, his breath catching. She was real, impossibly familiar, as if the dream had woven her into his reality. Their eyes met and a spark flared, recognition or something deeper. She approached, her smile tentative but warm. "Smells like heaven in here," she said, her voice a melody that stirred his heart. Samuel grinned, his nerves electric. "Made it myself. Try the sourdough. It's fresh." She nodded, selecting a loaf, and as he wrapped it, he felt the dream's echo in her presence. "You look familiar," he said, the words slipping out, bold yet vulnerable. "Like someone who'd remind a guy to keep going." She laughed, a sound like sunlight, and tilted her head. "Funny. You look like someone who doesn't need reminding?" They talked, the words flowing easily. Bread, life, the small joys that made a day worthwhile. Her laughter was a balm, her gaze steady, seeing him not as a laborer or a millionaire, but as Samuel, whole and enough. As she paid, their fingers brushed, a fleeting connection that felt like fate. "Come back," he said, his voice soft but sure. "I will," she promised, her smile a spark that lingered long after she left. Samuel stood alone, the bakery quiet, his heart full. The dream had been a mirror, showing him what he could lose and what he could build. He'd lost a family, a fortune that never was, but gained a life that was his own. As he kneaded the next batch of dough, the woman's face lingered, a hope for tomorrow. He was ready now, not for riches, but for connection, for a future shaped by his own hands. As Samuel's story draws to a close, his journey, from hardship to awakening, from dreams to a hard-earned reality, reminds us that true worth lies not in wealth, but in the courage to rise above our struggles and stay true to ourselves. What did his tale stir in you? Did it spark a reflection on your own dreams? Or perhaps a moment of resilience you faced? I'd love for you to share your thoughts. Your voice adds to the story's power. Thank you for joining me in this vibrant, heartfelt ride. Until we meet again for another tale, keep chasing what matters most.